Hi, I'm Mike, and I am going to be presenting the conclusions and the limitations and give you some ideas for discussion, hopefully, from that. So I'm going to flip to some slides here. Okay, here we go. All right, conclusions, limitations, and no, I'm going to take that out of there. Contribution log. Okay, so looking at the graph here, you'll see that there's some improvement from baseline. However, you'll also notice that there tends to be not that much room for improvement. In the case of Lauren, for example, there is virtually no change from baseline, at least the last part of baseline, into treatment here. And that's because she's already in the high 90 percentile range in baseline. There really isn't any more room for improvement. There's a little bit more room for improvement for Elizabeth up here, and even a little bit more for Mike right here. And you'll see that there is also a marked change from baseline, suggesting the treatment had some effect. So there's an improvement here, there's an improvement here. Some effect. The most noticeable improvement is for Mariah, whose baseline is fairly unstable, but then stabilizes in the 80th percentile range down here, like the mid 80s. Okay, so our goal was to replicate the Moore et al. Study, which has already been discussed. Their study is to demonstrate the effectiveness of self-monitoring for improving on-task behavior. Their subjects, 3 of them, were middle schoolers who were struggling in school and were given a vibrating tool known as the motivator, set to vibrate every 3 minutes, at which time subjects would note whether or not they were on task. Observers watched them and noted at the end of every 15 seconds if whether or not they were actually on task. And they did this for 30 minutes at a time, 30-minute sessions for a total of 120 intervals per session. Okay, so we also employed the motivator tool. We also employed a multiple baseline design, which can be purchased as a smartphone app, the motivator tool. And set it to the same 3-minute interval. We also use 15-second intervals for the actual observation. Some of the differences from the original study were that we are, first of all, we're graduate students and not struggling middle schoolers, at least not as far as I can tell. This, of course, must be considered in whether or not we are the most ideal subjects for such a study. But anyway, we wanted to improve our study habits. But as already been seen, there wasn't that much for improvement overall. However, there's probably more to it than that. And we'll talk about more of that in a minute, but it has to do with our observation procedure. We did make what we felt were improvements to the original study. We employed more sessions and eliminated any gaps in sessions so that we each recorded a minimum of 20 sessions. Their study did about 3 sessions per phase. We did 4. A minimum of 5 is ideal, but in the interest of time, we were given permission to do 3 or 4. We had 4 subjects where the Moore et al. Study only had 3. Also, in the interest of time, we shortened our sessions to 20 minutes instead of 30. We didn't think that would be that big of a deal. Probably the most significant difference, however, is in our observation procedure, which I already mentioned. Where the Moore study used trained observers, we video recorded ourselves and then functioned as our own observers. Okay, so how well was the study replicated? Well, in some of our own words, I felt our observation procedure had the unintended consequence of functioning as an intervention itself. From the very first baseline session, I was very aware of the fact that I was recording myself. For one thing, it forced me to sit at a desk and not move out of range of the camera unless I absolutely had to. My very first session I recorded as being 93% on task. Now, I doubt I'm 93% on task for anything. For the remaining baseline sessions, I found myself telling myself, act natural. Don't pay attention to the camera. And that may have helped a little. It got me out of the 90th percentile range and down into the high 70s or low 80s, but it still felt unnatural. Then, in treatment, it was like I told myself I could relax and be self-conscious of the camera. So that's kind of crazy. Elizabeth said she was off task in the beginning, but then stabilized. Elizabeth said she was off task in the beginning, but then stabilized in the 90 percentile range. The Motivator app helped her to improve and get closer to being 100% on task. Lauren said that knowing she was being recorded kept her on task, and that the Motivator app didn't do much for her. She also wanted to point out that our environments had a lot to do with how things worked out differently. Our environments were different among each of us, but also vastly different from the original study. Speaking of environments, Mariah reported the reason things worked out so well for her is that her son would need, if you look at Mariah back here, she's down here on the bottom, she had a lot of variation here, and then it stabilizes in baseline. She said the buzzing of the Motivator app helped bring her back to studying. She said video recording had less of an effect for her because of how she's video recorded at work all day. She said she's desensitized to it. So that really wasn't a factor for her. Okay. All right, so for the limitations, first of all, we are graduate students who are presumably already self-motivated. We have achieved some level of academic success, even though we all expressed a need to want to improve our on-task behavior. It still begs the question as to the level of need for an intervention like this in the first place. Though we probably benefit somewhat from an intervention like this, we are not ideal subjects for a research study. Second, the environment is not controlled like it is in the Moore study. We were at leisure to record ourselves anywhere and at any convenient time. In the Moore study, students were in a humanities class with other peers. Social pressures were in effect for them that weren't in effect for us. Third, the subject matter was pretty much ABA, which is what we're all in school for. That presumes a level of interest and motivation to learn that perhaps isn't there for middle schoolers in a humanities class. But again, the most significant limitation is the treatment effects of the observation procedure. In short, the knowledge that a camera was filming us in order to determine how on task we were was in itself an intervention, at least for some of us. And it was a factor that didn't exist in the study we replicated. Given this, we must question the extent to which our baseline readings were true baseline readings. More generally than this was the fact that we were all aware we were conducting a study on ourselves and that we were trying to replicate an existing study. We knew what we wanted our results to show. So there's the possibility that may have biased our results as well. Nevertheless, we are encouraged by the improvement we did see. Whatever the actual intervention was, the video recording or the Motivator app or both, something likely helped us to be better students. Future studies might want to take into consideration these limitations and explore ways to overcome them. Future studies might also consider the treatment effects of the observations themselves and how this alone might improve on-task behavior. And that is it for us. Thanks and good night. Where am I?